The smell hit Private James Chen before the screams did. Gasoline mixed with burning flesh, carried on the hot Pacific wind that swept across the southern ridges of Okinawa. April 1945. The sun hadn't fully risen, but the sky was already painted in shades of orange and black, colors that mimicked the flames his unit would soon unleash into the honeycomb of Japanese caves dotting the hillside ahead. James gripped the twin tanks strapped to his back, feeling their weight settle deeper into his shoulders. 70 pounds of napalm-thickened fuel. 70 pounds that made him slower than every other Marine in his squad. 70 pounds that made him a target the moment he stood up. "Chun, you ready?" Corporal Danny Sullivan stood beside him, checking the ignition mechanism on James's M2 flamethrower. Danny's hands moved with the practiced efficiency of a man who'd done this before, but his eyes betrayed something else. Fear, maybe, or pity. "As ready as I'll ever be, Sully." James tried to smile, but his lips were cracked from dehydration and stress. They'd been on this island for 3 weeks. In that time, he'd seen 12 flamethrower operators get hit. Some died instantly when sniper rounds pierced their fuel tanks. Others had just enough time to scream. Behind them, Private Marcus Washington sat against a coral outcropping, writing a letter he'd probably never mail. Marcus was their backup operator, the man who'd pick up the flamethrower if James went down. They didn't talk about it, but everyone knew the rotation. In this unit, flamethrower operators lasted an average of 3 days. "My mama used to make cornbread," Marcus said suddenly, not looking up from his letter. "Every Sunday after church. She'd put honey on top, let it melt down the sides." He paused, pen hovering over paper. "You think they'll tell her how I died? If I die, you think they'll tell her the truth?" James opened his mouth to respond, but Lieutenant Briggs cut him off. "Gather up. We move in 5. The lieutenant was young. 23, maybe 24, with a face that still held traces of the Ohio farm boy he'd been before the war. But his eyes were ancient. James had learned that eyes aged faster than faces in combat, especially for officers who had to order men to do impossible things. "Listen up," Briggs said, kneeling in the dirt so the dozen Marines could form a tight circle around him. "Intelligence says there's a command bunker in that ridge. 50, maybe 60 Japanese soldiers inside. Machine gun nests at the entrance. Our job is to clear it so the main force can advance up the hill." He looked directly at James. "Chen, you're going in first. Sullivan and Martinez will cover your approach with smoke grenades. Washington, you're 30 feet behind with the backup unit. The rest of you, suppressive fire on those cave openings the moment we start moving." James nodded, his throat too dry for words. He'd done this before, 6 times in 3 weeks. Each time he'd somehow survived. But the odds were mathematical, ruthless. The unofficial statistics circulated among the flamethrower operators. 92% casualty rate. Not killed in action casualties. That included wounded, burned, captured, or missing. Only 8 out of every 100 men who carried these weapons would walk off Okinawa in one piece. "Why us?" Private Eddie Kowalski had asked once back on the transport ship. "Why do flamethrowers get hit so much more than everyone else?" Sergeant McGrath, a veteran of Iwo Jima, had answered with brutal honesty. "Because you're slow. Because you're visible. Because when a Japanese soldier sees that tank on your back, he knows if he hits it, you'll turn into a Roman candle. And because—" McGrath had paused, making sure every operator heard this next part. "Because what you do is so horrible, so absolutely terrifying to the enemy, that killing you becomes worth any cost. You're not just a soldier to them. You're a demon, and they will sacrifice themselves to stop you." Now, crouched in the coral dust of Okinawa, James understood McGrath's words in his bones. The flamethrower wasn't just a weapon. It was a declaration. It said, "I will burn you alive in your hiding place. I will turn your shelter into your tomb." And the Japanese defenders, fighting with the desperation of men who knew surrender meant dishonor worse than death, would do anything to kill the man carrying that promise. "James." Danny's voice pulled him back to the present. "I need you to focus. Are you hearing me?" "I'm good." "No, you're not. Nobody's good before one of these runs. Danny placed a hand on James's shoulder. But you're the best operator we've got. You're smart. You don't rush. You don't panic. That's why you're still here. James wanted to laugh at that. Skill? He'd survived because of luck, nothing more. Pure, random, statistical luck that would eventually run out. The law of averages didn't care how careful you were. The squad began final preparations. James checked his flamethrower's ignition 3 times. The wand extended 4 feet from the gun body, ending in the igniter that would turn liquid fuel into a jet of flame. Effective range, about 30 yards. But to really clear a cave, to burn deep into the tunnels where Japanese soldiers crouched with explosives and rifles, you had to get close. 10 yards. Sometimes 5. Chun, one more thing, Lieutenant Briggs said quietly, pulling him aside. If you go down, I need you to try to fall away from the squad. The fuel tanks, if they rupture. I know, sir. James had seen it happen. Private Tommy Rodriguez, 2 weeks ago. A sniper round hit his tanks from the side, and the pressurized fuel had sprayed across 4 Marines. 3 died. The 4th was still in the field hospital, if he was still alive at all. 5 minutes, someone called. James closed his eyes and thought about San Francisco, about the smell of his mother's kitchen, about his kid sister Sarah practicing piano, about the life that existed in some other world, some universe where 19-year-old boys didn't carry liquid fire into caves to burn other 19-year-old boys alive. When he opened his eyes, the sun had cleared the horizon. It was time. They moved forward in a crouch, weaving between coral outcroppings that offered pathetic cover against the fortified Japanese positions ahead. The island of Okinawa was beautiful in a savage way. Green hills terraced with ancient farming plots, purple flowers blooming between rocks, the ocean visible as a stripe of impossible blue in the distance. But every cave, every ridge, every stone wall had been transformed into a fighting position. James's breathing was already labored. The flamethrower tanks shifted with each step, throwing off his balance. His palms were slick with sweat inside his gloves. The morning heat was building, and he was wearing 70 pounds of fuel while running toward machine gun fire. Behind him, Marcus whispered, "You got this, brother. In and out. Just like last time." But last time was different. Last time the cave was smaller. Last time they had artillery support. Last time James hadn't been thinking about the 92% statistic every single second. They trained him at Camp Pendleton in California, showing him how to operate the M2 flamethrower in controlled conditions. They taught him to aim low, to sweep the flame in controlled bursts, to clear rooms methodically. What they hadn't taught him was what it felt like to watch men burn. They hadn't taught him about the sounds, the screaming that sometimes lasted for minutes. They hadn't taught him that he'd stop sleeping through the night, that every time he closed his eyes he'd see the shapes writhing in the flame. "Smoke out!" Sullivan shouted, and 3 grenades arced through the air, landing in a rough line between the squad and the cave entrance. White smoke billowed up, creating a curtain that would hide their advance for maybe 30 seconds. "Move, move, move!" Lieutenant Briggs yelled. James ran. His legs pumped, his lungs burned, and the tanks bounced against his spine with each stride. The smoke was thick, disorienting. He could hear the crack of rifle fire, the deeper rattle of machine guns, but couldn't tell which direction the shots were coming from. 20 yards to the cave entrance. 15. Something snapped past his head. A bullet that missed by inches. James dropped to one knee behind a low stone wall, gasping. His hands found the flamethrower's trigger mechanism. He could see the cave mouth now, a dark opening in the hillside about 8 feet wide. Shadows moved inside. "Chun, you're clear. Go now." Sullivan's voice cut through the chaos. This was the moment when every flamethrower operator had to make the same insane choice. Stand up and become visible. Stand up and trust that your squad would suppress enough enemy fire to let you cover those final 10 yards. Stand up knowing that you were about to become the single most obvious target on the battlefield. James thought about his father, who'd emigrated from Guangdong province to San Francisco in 1923, who'd worked 16-hour days in a laundry, saving every penny. who'd wept with pride when James enlisted, even though it meant his only son might die fighting for a country that had passed laws specifically to keep people like them out. For all the ones who came before, his father had said the night before James shipped out. For all the ones who will come after, you show them what we are. James stood up. Immediately, a bullet struck the coral outcropping 2 feet from his head, showering him with stinging fragments. He ran forward, the flamethrower wand extended. 5 yards. 3 yards. He could smell the cave now, earth and gunpowder and human waste. A Japanese soldier appeared at the cave entrance, rifle raised. James didn't think. He pulled the trigger. The flamethrower roared to life with a sound like a dragon's breath. A jet of ignited napalm shot from the wand, crossing the space between James and the cave in less than a second. The flame was orange and yellow and bright enough to hurt his eyes even in daylight. It splashed against the cave entrance and rolled inside like liquid fire. The soldier at the entrance disappeared into the flame. His scream was cut short, whether by death or by the fire consuming all the oxygen. James didn't know. The cave mouth became an inferno. James swept the flame back and forth, pouring fire into every corner of the entrance, ensuring the napalm reached deep into the tunnel system. 7 seconds. 8, 9. The flamethrower had about 10 seconds of fuel per sustained burst. James had to make every second count because the moment he released the trigger, the Japanese soldiers deeper in the tunnel system might rush the entrance. 10 seconds. He released the trigger. The flame cut off, leaving a wall of thick black smoke pouring from the cave mouth. The heat was intense, making the air shimmer. "Fall back," Lieutenant Briggs ordered. "Let it burn." Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. James turned to run, but his foot caught on a rock. He stumbled and the heavy tanks pulled him sideways. He went down hard, landing on his shoulder. The flamethrower wand struck the ground, and for one terrifying second, James thought he might accidentally trigger it and burn himself alive. Hands grabbed him, Danny and Marcus hauling him to his feet. They pulled him back toward cover as rifle fire cracked overhead. 20 yards. 30. They dove behind the coral outcropping where the squad had gathered. "You hit," Danny demanded, checking James for wounds. No, I'm good." James's hands were shaking so badly, he could barely unbuckle the flamethrower harness. "Outstanding work, Chun," Lieutenant Briggs said. "That bunker's done. We'll let the fire burn out the rest of the tunnel system." James nodded, but he wasn't listening. He was thinking about the soldier at the cave entrance. The one who'd been there for maybe half a second before the flame took him. Had he been young? Old? Did he have a family in Japan waiting for him to come home? Marcus sat down next to him, offering a canteen. "Drink. You need water." James drank, the lukewarm water tasting like metal. His stomach churned. This was his 7th time using the flamethrower in combat. 7 times he'd poured fire into caves and bunkers. 7 times he'd created that specific kind of hell. And each time, a small piece of him had burned away too. The piece that believed he was a good person, that believed war had honor, that believed he'd ever sleep peacefully again. "How many more?" James asked quietly. "How many more caves before we're done with this island?" Danny looked at the ridge system stretching north. "Dozens of caves. Hundreds, maybe. I don't know, brother. I don't know." By the 3rd week of May, James had used the flamethrower 19 times. He'd stopped counting the caves. He'd stopped thinking about the men inside them. The only way to survive mentally, emotionally, was to become mechanical. Wake up. Eat terrible rations. Clean the flamethrower. Advance. Burn. Retreat. Sleep if possible. Repeat. The 92% casualty rate wasn't just a statistic anymore. It was names and faces. Private Rodriguez with the fuel spray. Sergeant Kowalski, shot through the neck on his 4th operation. Private Chen, no relation to James, whose fuel tank had been pierced by shrapnel, causing a slow leak that created a trail of fire behind him as he ran. He'd survived, but with burns covering 40% of his body. James was now the senior flamethrower operator in the entire company. At 19 years old, he'd outlasted men with more training, more experience, more everything. It made no sense, which meant it was pure luck. And luck always ran out. "We're moving on Sugarloaf Hill today," Lieutenant Briggs announced during the morning briefing. His face was gaunt, age 10 years in 6 weeks. Intelligence estimates 300 Japanese defenders dug into the ridge system. The hill's been reinforced with concrete bunkers and interconnected tunnels. "We've tried to take it twice already. Lost a lot of good men." James knew what that meant. More caves, more close-quarters work, more opportunities for his luck to expire. The company moved out at 0600 hours, a column of exhausted Marines trudging up the muddy slope toward Sugarloaf Hill. The rain had started overnight and turned the volcanic soil into slippery clay. James fell 3 times in the first 100 yards, the flamethrower tanks making it impossible to catch his balance. "You need help?" Marcus asked, now carrying the backup flamethrower unit. Marcus had lost weight, his uniform hanging loose on his frame. They all had. You couldn't eat properly when you knew you might be dead by evening. "I'm fine," James lied. The first bunker appeared at the base of the hill, a concrete structure with firing slits barely visible through camouflage. Machine gun fire erupted from inside, cutting down 2 Marines before the squad could take cover. "Chun, that's yours," Briggs shouted over the gunfire. James assessed the situation. The bunker was well positioned, with clear lines of fire covering the approach. To get within flamethrower range, he'd have to cross 30 yards of open ground while machine gunners specifically targeted him. Even with covering fire from the squad, it was nearly suicidal. "I need to smoke. A lot of it," James called back. 5 smoke grenades arced through the air, creating a thick gray curtain. James ran. His lungs screamed. His legs burned. Bullets snapped through the smoke like angry hornets. One grazed his helmet with a metallic ping that made his ears ring. 10 yards from the bunker. 5 yards. He could hear Japanese voices inside, shouting orders. He raised the flamethrower wand and aimed at the firing slit. The trigger pulled. The flame shot forward, narrower than usual because he was aiming through a small opening. The napalm jet threaded through the slit and exploded inside the bunker. The screaming started immediately, high-pitched, desperate sounds that made James's stomach turn. He held the trigger down, pouring fire into the bunker until the flamethrower sputtered empty. When he released the trigger, smoke poured from every opening in the structure. James turned to run, but something hit him hard in the right leg. The impact spun him around, and he crashed to the ground. Pain exploded up his thigh, white-hot and consuming. He'd been shot. "Chen's down. Medic!" Danny's voice seemed to come from very far away. Hands grabbed James under the arms, dragging him back toward cover. Every bump sent fresh waves of agony through his leg. He looked down and saw blood, so much blood, soaking through his pants. Corpsman Bailey appeared, his hands already moving to apply a tourniquet. "You're okay, Marine. You're going to be okay. This is $1 million wound. Gets you off this rock." James wanted to laugh. $1 million wound. The injury that was bad enough to send you home but not bad enough to kill or cripple you. He'd survived 19 flamethrower operations only to get shot running away from the 20th. "Chun, stay with me," Bailey commanded, tightening the tourniquet. "Tell me about home. Where are you from?" "San Francisco," James managed through gritted teeth. "Chinatown. My dad, he runs a laundry on Grant Avenue." "Good, good. You're going to see that laundry again. Going to help your dad with the pressing and folding." Bailey worked as he talked, packing the wound with sulfa powder and bandaging it with practiced efficiency. "You did good here, Marine. More than good. You're a hero." James didn't feel like a hero. He felt like a 19-year-old kid who'd spent 6 weeks burning other 19-year-old kids alive and somehow hadn't died in the process. The mathematical improbability of his survival made no sense. Out of every 100 flamethrower operators who'd landed on Okinawa, only 8 were supposed to survive. He was one of the 8. But Tommy Rodriguez hadn't been. Eddie Kowalski hadn't been. Private Chen, the other Chen, barely qualified as a survivor with his burns. "Stretcher bearers," Bailey called. "We're taking him to the field hospital." As they loaded James onto the stretcher, he saw Marcus standing nearby with the backup flamethrower strapped to his back. Their eyes met. Marcus gave a small nod, acknowledgement, respect, goodbye. In 60 seconds, Marcus would be ordered to clear the next bunker. The rotation continued. The mathematics were ruthless. "Marcus," James called out weakly, "your mama's cornbread. Tell me about it again." Marcus smiled, but his eyes were wet. "Honey melting down the sides, brother. Every Sunday. When I get home, I'm going to eat nothing but cornbread for a week straight." "When you get home," James repeated, wanting to believe it was possible. The stretcher bearers lifted him and began the careful journey down the muddy hill toward the rear area. Above them, the battle for Sugar Loaf Hill continued. The crack of rifles, the crump of mortars, and somewhere in that chaos, the roar of a flamethrower as Marcus took his turn at the cave entrance. James closed his eyes and let the pain medication Bailey had injected take effect. The sounds of battle faded. For the first time in 6 weeks, he felt something other than fear and exhaustion. He felt guilt, survivor's guilt, the kind that would follow him home to San Francisco, that would sit beside him at his father's dinner table, that would wake him up at night for the rest of his life. He'd survived the 92%. But the price of that survival wasn't just the wound in his leg. It was carrying the names of everyone who hadn't made it. It was knowing that right now, at this moment, Marcus was standing where James had stood 20 minutes ago. Slow, visible, terrified. And the mathematics didn't care about courage or skill or cornbread or any of it. The field hospital was a collection of tents erected in a valley 2 miles from the front lines. Even here, the sound of artillery rumbled like distant thunder. James lay on a cot, his leg elevated and wrapped in clean bandages. Corpsman Bailey had been right. The bullet had passed through muscle without hitting bone or major arteries. James would recover. He'd be sent to a hospital ship, then possibly to Hawaii or even back to the States. He'd survived. Around him, dozens of other wounded Marines filled the tent. Some slept under morphine. Others stared at the canvas ceiling with empty eyes. A private across the aisle was missing both legs below the knee. He couldn't have been older than 20. "Chen," a familiar voice cut through James's thoughts. He turned his head and saw Danny Sullivan standing beside the cot, his uniform filthy with mud and ash. Danny's face was harder than it had been that morning. Something had happened since James left. "Sully, you okay?" Danny didn't answer immediately. He pulled up a wooden crate and sat down heavily. "Marcus is dead." The words hit James like a physical blow. "What happened?" "Second bunker up the ridge." He got within range, started to fire, and a Japanese soldier came out of a spider hole behind him. Close-range rifle shot to the fuel tanks. Danny's voice was flat, emotionless. The explosion killed the Japanese soldier too, and it wounded 2 other guys in the squad. James felt his chest tighten. Marcus Washington, the kid from Alabama who wrote letters he never mailed, who talked about his mama's cornbread, who'd been 30 feet behind James during every operation, waiting to become the next operator if James went down. The rotation had continued. The mathematics had claimed another name. "Lieutenant Briggs put me in for a medal for you," Danny continued. "Bronze Star with V device for valor. For the 19 successful bunker clearances. For staying calm under fire. For being, and I quote, the most effective flamethrower operator in the regiment." James wanted to vomit. A medal. They were giving him a medal while Marcus was dead. While Tommy Rodriguez was dead. While Eddie Kowalski was dead. "I don't want it," James said. "Doesn't matter what you want. Command needs heroes. Needs stories about brave Marines doing impossible things. You're that story now." Danny leaned forward, his voice dropping. "You know what the real story is, though? The story they'll never tell." James waited. "The story is that the command knows exactly what happens to flamethrower operators. They know the casualty rate. They know that asking a man to carry those tanks is essentially asking him to volunteer for death. But they need the flamethrowers because nothing else can clear those caves. Artillery can't reach deep enough. Regular infantry can't force the Japanese out. So they feed operators into the meat grinder, one after another, knowing that 92% of them won't come home whole. Danny stood up abruptly. They're putting me on flamethrower duty tomorrow. I'm the next operator in the rotation. James felt ice in his veins. Danny, no. You're a squad leader. You don't have to. Everyone has to. That's how this works. We're running out of trained operators faster than we can ship in replacements. So now regular infantry are getting crash courses and taking the job. Danny's laugh was bitter. 3 days ago, I couldn't have told you how to ignite the damn thing. Tomorrow, I'll be carrying 70 pounds of napalm up a hill while Japanese snipers take aim at my back. Then refuse. Tell Briggs you won't do it. And say what? That I'm too scared? That my life is worth more than the kid who'll take my place. Danny shook his head. No, I'm gonna do my job. Just like you did. Just like Marcus did. And maybe I'll be one of the 8%. Or maybe I won't. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded letter. Marcus asked me to mail this if anything happened to him. It's to his mother. I read it. I know I shouldn't have, but I did. Danny's voice cracked. He told her he was proud to serve, that he believed in what he was doing, that she should be happy because he died a hero. But, James prompted, but the truth is he died screaming in a fireball because some general decided Sugarloaf Hill needed to be taken by June. He died because we needed that strategic position so badly that we were willing to sacrifice however many operators it took to burn out those caves. His death had nothing to do with honor or heroism or pride. It was mathematics. Cold, brutal mathematics. Danny placed the letter on James's cot. When you get home, if they ask you about the war, about what it was like, tell them about the 92%. Tell them what it meant to be a flamethrower operator. Tell them about Marcus and Tommy and Eddie and all the others whose names nobody will remember. I will, James promised. I swear it. Danny nodded and turned to leave. At the tent entrance, he paused. You know what's funny? The Japanese soldiers in those caves. They're terrified of flamethrowers. Intelligence reports say some of them would rather commit suicide than face the fire. And I get it now. I understand that terror. Because it's one thing to die from a bullet or shrapnel. It's quick, usually. But fire takes its time. He walked out into the fading daylight, leaving James alone with his thoughts and the letter from a dead man. James unfolded the letter and read Marcus's careful handwriting. Dear Mama, if you're reading this, then I've gone to be with the Lord. The words blurred as tears filled James's eyes. He'd survived 19 operations. He'd beaten the 92% casualty rate through nothing but random chance. And now he'd get to go home to San Francisco, to his father's laundry, to a life after war. But he'd carry these ghosts forever. The hospital ship USS Solace carried James across the Pacific toward Pearl Harbor. His leg healed slowly, the pain fading to a dull ache that flared up whenever the weather changed. Physical wounds could be treated with sulfa drugs and clean bandages. The other wounds, the ones that woke him up screaming in the night, had no treatment. He learned about the end of the Battle of Okinawa from a Navy nurse. June 21, 1945. The island was secured after 82 days of combat. American casualties, over 49,000. Japanese casualties, over 100,000. The numbers were so large they became meaningless, abstract. But James knew the numbers that mattered. Private Marcus Washington, 20 years old. Sergeant Eddie Kowalski, 23. Private Tommy Rodriguez, 19. Corporal Danny Sullivan. The nurse had brought him that news personally. Danny had lasted 3 days as a flamethrower operator. On his 4th operation, a mortar round had landed 10 feet from him. He'd survived the initial explosion, but the fuel tanks had ruptured. The nurse didn't give James details, and he didn't ask. The 92% casualty rate had claimed another friend. In Pearl Harbor, they transferred James to a hospital for further recovery. A young officer arrived one afternoon with a wooden box containing the Bronze Star Medal. There was a small ceremony. a dozen other wounded Marines watching as the officer read citations and pinned medals on chests. When they called James's name, he stood on his wounded leg and listened to words about extraordinary heroism and selfless dedication to duty. All James could think about was Marcus's letter. Tell them about the 92%. Sir, James said when the officer finished the citation. May I say something? The officer looked surprised but nodded. Of course, Private. James looked at the assembled Marines. Some missing limbs, others with faces scarred by burns, all of them carrying invisible wounds that would never fully heal. I accept this medal on behalf of every flamethrower operator who served on Okinawa, especially those who didn't make it home. We were asked to do an impossible job with impossible odds, and most of us became casualties doing it. The real heroes are the ones who aren't here. Remember their names. Remember what they sacrificed. Later, alone in his hospital bed, James wrote his own letter. Not to his father, he'd write that one later. This letter was to the Department of the Army, care of whatever office handled after-action reports. To whom it may concern, he wrote, I am writing to report on the casualty rate among flamethrower operators during the Battle of Okinawa. Of the operators in my company, 92% became casualties, killed, wounded, or missing. This rate is unsustainable and represents a fundamental tactical problem. He continued for 3 pages detailing the specific vulnerabilities. The weight of the tanks making operators slow targets, the visibility of the equipment, the psychological effect on enemy soldiers that made killing operators a priority, the fuel tank vulnerability to any kind of projectile. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. If the military continues to employ flamethrowers in future operations, James concluded, I recommend the following. Lighter fuel tanks, better protective armor, tactical doctrine changes to minimize operator exposure, and significantly enhanced training for all personnel who may be required to serve in this role. The current casualty rate represents not just a tactical failure but a moral one. These men deserve better. He didn't know if anyone would read his letter. I didn't know if it would make any difference. But Marcus had asked him to tell the truth about the 92%. And this was the only way James knew how. 3 weeks later, they discharged him from the hospital with orders to report to Camp Pendleton for evaluation before final discharge. His leg had healed enough to walk without crutches, though he'd probably always have a slight limp. The war in the Pacific ended on August 15, 1945, with Japan's surrender. James was in California when he heard the news. People poured into the streets celebrating. Strangers hugged each other. Someone thrust a bottle of champagne into James's hands. He stood on a street corner in Los Angeles, watching the celebration, feeling utterly disconnected from the joy around him. The war was over. He'd survived. But Marcus hadn't. Danny hadn't. Tommy, Eddie, and dozens of others whose names he'd never even learned. They hadn't survived to see this moment. That night, James finally wrote to his father. Dear Ba, he began in Chinese characters, then switched to English because some things were easier to say in his adopted language. I am coming home. I was wounded but will recover fully. I received a medal for bravery, but I do not feel brave. I feel like a man who witnessed terrible things and somehow survived when better men did not. When I return to San Francisco, I will work hard at the laundry. I will honor the family name. I will try to be the son you hoped I would become. But I need you to know that part of me will always remain on Okinawa, in the caves and bunkers where we fought. That part of me died with my friends, and I will never get it back. I do not know how to carry this grief. I do not know how to reconcile survival with guilt. But I promise you this. I will live a good life. I will make their sacrifice mean something, and I will never forget. Your son, James. He sealed the letter and walked to the post office through streets still filled with celebrating crowds. The war was over. Life would continue. But for James Chen, and for the 8% of flamethrower operators who survived Okinawa, the battle would never truly end. San Francisco, 1947. James stood in the doorway of his father's laundry, pressing steam rising from the industrial machines behind him. 2 years since Okinawa. 2 years of nightmares, of waking up smelling gasoline that wasn't there, of flinching at sudden loud noises. But also 2 years of healing slowly in the only ways he knew how. He'd kept his promise to Marcus. When veterans groups invited him to speak, he told them about the 92% casualty rate. He explained what it meant to carry a flamethrower into combat, knowing the mathematics were against you. Some audiences didn't want to hear it, preferred stories of heroism without the darkness. But others, especially other veterans, nodded in understanding. The military had read his letter, apparently. New doctrine for flamethrower operations appeared in training manuals. Tactics to minimize operator exposure, lighter fuel tanks, better protective equipment. It wouldn't bring back the men who died on Okinawa, but maybe it would save lives in future wars. If there were future wars. James prayed there wouldn't be. His younger sister Sarah was 17 now, still playing piano. She'd performed a recital last month, and James had sat in the audience thinking about Marcus, wondering if he'd ever heard his sister play before the war took him. "James!" His father called from the back room. "Customer at counter." He turned from the door and went to help a woman with her dry cleaning. Normal life, mundane tasks, the beautiful simplicity of days that didn't involve fire or death or choosing which cave to burn next. But some nights, when the fog rolled in from the bay and the city grew quiet, James would stand on the roof of the building and look toward the Pacific Ocean. Somewhere beyond that horizon lay an island he'd never forget. Sugar Loaf Hill, where the caves still bore scorch marks from napalm. Where the ghosts of 92% of his fellow operators remained, whether their bodies had been recovered or not. He joined the 8% who survived. The statistical anomaly, the unlikely outcome, and he'd spend the rest of his life wondering why him and not them. Why his luck had held when Danny's hadn't. Why he got to press shirts in his father's laundry while Marcus would never taste his mama's corn bread again. 1952. The Korean War brought flamethrowers back into the headlines. James read the newspaper reports with a sick feeling in his stomach. Different peninsula, different enemy, same tactics. Same casualty rates among operators, though the official numbers were classified now. A young Marine, couldn't have been older than 20, came into the laundry one afternoon. He was on leave before shipping out to Korea, visiting family in Chinatown. He saw James's Bronze Star certificate framed on the wall. "You served?" the young Marine asked. "Okinawa. Flamethrower operator." The kid's eyes widened. "They're training me on flamethrowers at Pendleton. Any advice?" James looked at this boy because that's what he was, really just a boy, and thought about all the things he could say. About 92%. About Marcus and Danny and all the others. About nightmares that never stopped. About the weight of survival. Instead, he said, "Keep your head down. Move fast. Don't volunteer for extra operations. And write letters home. Even if you never mail them, write them anyway." The kid nodded seriously, not understanding that James had just tried to give him tools for surviving both the war and what came after. After the Marine left, James sat at the counter for a long time, staring at his hands. These hands had pulled the trigger 19 times, had poured fire into caves and bunkers, had killed, he didn't know how many men. Dozens, probably. The hands looked normal, ordinary. But James knew what they'd done. 1965. Sarah married a lawyer named Thomas Chen, no relation, and moved to Oakland. She asked James to walk her down the aisle since their father had passed 2 years earlier. At the reception, Thomas's grandfather, a veteran of World War I, cornered James by the punch bowl. "Sarah tells me you were in Okinawa," the old man said. "Yes, sir. Flamethrowers." James nodded, surprised the old man knew. "My grandson in the family, a different branch, he was a flamethrower operator in France. 1918. Died when his fuel tank was hit by shrapnel." The old man's eyes were distant. "They told us he was a hero. Maybe he was. But I always wondered if someone in command looked at the casualty rates and decided it was an acceptable loss. Whether they calculated that X number of dead operators was worth my strategic objective." 92%, James said quietly. "On Okinawa, 92% of us became casualties." The old man's face hardened. "And they kept sending men anyway. Yes, sir. They kept sending men. They stood in silence for a moment. Two men separated by nearly 50 years but connected by the understanding of what war demanded and what it left behind. 1975. Vietnam was over. Another war, another generation of young men carrying wounds visible and invisible. James was 50 now, running the laundry alone since his father's death. His hair was graying at the temples, and the old leg wound ached in cold weather. A documentary filmmaker contacted him through a veterans organization. She was making a film about flamethrower operators across different wars: World War II, Korea, Vietnam. Would James be willing to be interviewed? He agreed, though part of him wondered if reopening these memories was wise. They filmed in the laundry on a Sunday when it was closed. James sat on a stool, the filmmaker's lights hot on his face, and told the stories he'd been carrying for 30 years. About the 92% casualty rate. About Marcus Washington and Danny Sullivan. About being 19 years old and carrying 70 pounds of napalm up a hill while men tried to kill you. Why do you think you survived when so many others didn't? The filmmaker asked. James had thought about this question for 3 decades. Luck, he said finally. Pure, random, meaningless luck. I wasn't braver than Marcus. I wasn't smarter than Danny. I just happened to be standing in the right place at the right moment 19 times in a row. And then I got shot in the leg, which paradoxically saved my life by taking me off the line. Do you consider yourself a hero? No. The heroes are the ones who didn't come home. I'm just a survivor who's been trying to figure out how to live with that for 30 years. The documentary aired on PBS the following year. James watched it alone in his apartment above the laundry. Seeing himself on screen was surreal, this middle-aged man with sad eyes talking about things that happened to a 19-year-old boy. But when they showed the statistics, the 92% casualty rate displayed as a graphic, the names of dead operators scrolling across the screen, James felt a sense of completion. Marcus had asked him to tell people about the 92%. He'd finally done it in a way that might reach beyond veterans' halls and memorial services. 1995. The 50th anniversary of VJ Day brought renewed interest in World War II veterans. James was 70 now, fully retired, spending his days reading and taking slow walks through Chinatown. The military invited him to a ceremony in Washington, D.C., honoring surviving flamethrower operators from the Pacific Theater. There were 12 of them at the ceremony. 12 men out of hundreds who'd carried those tanks into battle. The 8% now winnowed further by age and time. They sat in a row on a stage while a general gave a speech about sacrifice and duty. Afterward, the 12 operators gathered in a hotel conference room, away from cameras and officials. They shared stories, compared scars, and spoke the names of men who hadn't made it. It was the first time James had been in a room with other men who truly understood what it meant to be a flamethrower operator. The weight they'd carried, the targets they'd been, the mathematics that should have killed them all. Did you ever figure out why we survived? Asked a man named Robert Patterson who'd operated on Iwo Jima. No, James admitted. But I learned to accept it. We survived so we could bear witness. So the Marcus Washingtons and Danny Sullivans wouldn't be forgotten. Another operator, a quiet man named Frank Morrison, said, My therapist told me something once. She said survivor's guilt is just love with nowhere to go. We love the men who died, and that love has to go somewhere, so it becomes guilt. But maybe we honor them better by living fully, by making our survival mean something. James thought about that. 50 years of guilt, reframed as love. It didn't erase the nightmares or the grief, but it offered a different way of carrying it. 2005. James Chen died peacefully in his sleep at age 79. His sister Sarah and her children were with him at the end. Among his possessions, they found boxes of letters. Some sent, most unsent. Letters to Marcus Washington's mother, apologizing for surviving when her son didn't. Letters to Danny Sullivan's family, explaining what a good man he'd been. Letters to the Department of Defense, still asking after all these years why the casualty rate had been acceptable. At his funeral, the Marine Corps sent an honor guard. They folded the flag from his coffin and presented it to Sarah. A young Marine corporal, couldn't have been older than 23, stood at attention and saluted James's memory. Sarah looked at this young Marine and thought about her brother at that age. About the impossible things he'd been asked to do. About the 92% who'd never made it home. "Thank you," she said to the corporal. "My brother would have appreciated this." The corporal nodded. "Ma'am, I want you to know I studied flamethrower tactics in training. They teach us about the operators from Okinawa, about the casualty rates, about the changes in doctrine that came from their sacrifice. Your brother's service helped save lives. The letter he wrote after the battle, it's in the military archives. Required reading for fire support specialists." Sarah hadn't known about the letter. After the funeral, she requested a copy from the archives. Reading her brother's words from 60 years ago, written in a hospital bed while his wounds were still fresh, she finally understood the weight he'd carried all those years. "These men deserve better," James had written in 1945. And because he'd written it, because he'd survived long enough to tell the truth about the 92%, things had changed. Not enough, maybe. War was still war. But somewhere, in some future battle, operators would have better training, better equipment, better odds. Because James Chen and the other survivors had refused to let the statistics go unquestioned. The sun set over San Francisco, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. Colors that might have reminded James of fire, of burning caves on a distant island. Or colors that might have simply been beautiful, a reminder that the world contained both darkness and light, both mathematics and mercy. In a small military cemetery in Okinawa, a memorial stone bore the names of American soldiers who died in the battle. Among them Washington, Marcus, Sullivan, Daniel, Rodriguez, Tomas, Kowalski, Edward, and hundreds of others. Their names would not be forgotten. 92% would be remembered.